In today's video, we're going to take a look at the brand new releases from the Bimber distillery called Spirit of the Underground. Welcome everyone to the channel, and we've just passed that milestone of 1,000 subscribers, so we thought we would splash out on a new camera and a new microphone, so hopefully you will see the difference. And a big thank you to everyone who's come on this journey so far, and if you're new to us, please make sure you like and subscribe to this video and this channel, because we're putting out a lot of content all the time about whiskey and whiskey investment. This new release from the Bimber distillery in London is called Spirit of the Underground, and it's in collaboration with Transport for London, and the whole series is sort of to do with the stations on the London Underground network. Now, what's interesting about this, that there's 270 stations on the London Underground network, so we'll talk about that a bit more later on in the video. But this first release, the starting point of this series, has 4 stations on there. You've got Waterloo, Baker Street, King's Cross St Pancras and Oxford Circus. Now, the whiskey itself, it's all no age statement, which is pretty common for distilleries to do releases like this, and I think it's quite a wise move as well. And they're all single-cask bottlings in this release, with an outrun of between sort of 200, 250, 280 bottles, and because they're all bottled at around 58%, I'm assuming that they're at cask strength too, and they're all in ex-bourbon casks, which is pretty much par for the course with Bimber. Most of their releases have been bourbon, and not too many have come from sherry. Now, the other thing that's appealing about this, this release, is the price point. It's £125 a bottle, which is a lot cheaper than many of the earlier Bimber releases. But before we start looking a bit more in detail about this particular series, let's take a look at the distillery itself. The Bimber distillery was founded in London in 2015, but it didn't start distilling its single malts until 2016. Now, most of the images that you'll see of the distillery, including the ones that we're putting on the B-roll here, are from inside the distillery. Now, there's a reason for this. I think they won't mind me saying this, it's a bit of an ugly building. It's just on the middle of an industrial estate in London, and it's not what you would describe as being your stereotypical distillery. Now, what I like about Bimber is that they own this fact. They're a London-based distillery, they're an urban distillery, and they're on an industrial estate, but they don't make any, they don't try and hide this fact from people. Now, there are a few distilleries up in Scotland. One of them keeps popping up on my Facebook feed, trying to sell me casks as an investment, and when you start looking at them, they try and paint this picturesque, romantic vision of them being a beautiful Scottish distillery, and actually, they're just on an industrial unit. And I think at least with Bimber, they're an urban distillery, they're a London distillery, and they own the fact and they own their location. So I think that's a good thing with them. Now, with their production, they've got quite a sort of focus on terroir, and there's a recent book that I've just listened to or read about terroir. It's an audiobook. It's actually the first audiobook on whiskey that I've found recently. So I'll put a link to that below, because it's actually really interesting reading. And when you listen to that about how terroir affects the taste of your spirit and taste of your new make, Bimber really have a focus on the quality of the whiskey that they produce. In terms of all of their barley is sourced locally in Hampshire, it's all floor malted, and it's made and produced in small batches. So the washed still only holds about 1,000 litres, and the spirit still itself only holds about 600 litres. Now, Macallan talk about their curiously small stills, but this Bimber still, it's about 85% of the size, 85% smaller than Macallan stills, so the production is very limited. And I found an early press release, and they were saying they were hoping to produce about 700 to 750 casks a year in 2020. Given that we know how limited production is at Bimber, let's take a look at this series, because as we've mentioned, there are 270 underground stations, and I think it's unfeasible and unrealistic for Bimber to release a single cask release for all of these all of these stations. And when you price that up, there'll be 270 stations at £125 a bottle. It would mean it would cost you £33,000 to collect the set. Now, if you think that collecting the set is the point here, I think you're missing the bigger picture with this. And this is what I think is like the genius master play with this piece of marketing that they've done. It gives the collector something else to hold on to other than the whiskey. As in, people who really don't care about whiskey could buy into this series of bottlings. And I think this is what Macallan have done to perfection with their folio range. No one really cares about the whiskey. No one really knows about the whiskey in the folio bottles. There's not much differentiation each time like there was in the Edition series, for instance, that made a big difference between each release. Now, if you come back to these Bimber releases, nobody cares about the whiskey inside it, arguably. And if you watch our video about the 37-year-old Macallan, you'll see that nobody really cares too much about the quality of the whiskey. It's all to do with the perception of it. Now, these Bimber releases, they're very clever with what they've done. They've picked 4 London Underground stations for the first 4 releases. Now, is this by accident that they've picked King's Cross, Waterloo, Oxford Circus and Baker Street? I don't think so. King's Cross is the most visited underground station on the London Underground network, getting 97.7 million journeys a year from it. It serves 2 major train stations. It serves King's Cross and it serves St Pancras, and it's also an interchange between 6 of the 11 underground lines. So there's a chance if you've been to London, you're going to have been through King's Cross. Waterloo, it's right next to Westminster Bridge, right near Big Ben, and there's lots of access to other theatres. And guess what? That's the 2nd most visited London Underground station. Oxford Circus, any guesses? Yep, it's the 3rd most visited London Underground station, and it's, you know, close to Oxford Road, which was pre-COVID Europe's busiest shopping district or shopping street in all of Europe. And then of course Baker Street, that is the one that isn't in the top 10 of the busiest London Underground stations, but of course it's, you know, it's home to a high tourist footfall platform or station because your associations with Sherlock Holmes and the Sherlock Holmes Museum. And that is the point with these series. Like, yes, Bimber, you make great whiskey, but the collectors of these bottles aren't really going to care about how good the whiskey is in each side of it. They're going to collect stations and platforms that mean a lot to them, you know. So I, for instance, you know, I would pick up some of these first releases because I've got clients that, you know, live in the vicinity of these stations, and they would make great gifts. And even if they've got no interest in Scotch whiskey or English whiskey or any whiskey, there's a hook for them. And that means that you've got a much wider pool of buyers, and that means that you've got a much larger pool of collectors to go for these single cask limited edition releases. The next logical question then is how well these bottles are going to perform as an investment. And if you look at the data for most Bimber releases, and we'll put a load of graphs on the screen now from Whiskey Hunter, you'll see that there's a trend. You've got a high price from the first release, and then you see a constant downward trend for later bottlings, you know, later appearances at auction. So there's pretty much a high price on release, and then that interest drops and the price drops accordingly. And that's across several of the Bimber bottlings, and I think this is just the flippers getting carried away. Now, there's 2 ways to look at these bottles if you want to look at them as an investment. First of all, if you want to make the most money from them in the shortest period of time, buy them in the ballot, flip them in auction. You've got a massive precedent for the highest prices being in that first auction. But I think that would be missing the point of these bottles. The point of these bottles is not to appeal to whiskey collectors or whiskey drinkers per se. You're looking for people who've got an interest in London, and you've got lots of tourists coming into London. You've got lots of whiskey tourists coming to the UK from America, from Asia, from Europe, everywhere. This could be a really good series. Maybe not in the short term, sort of 1-2 years, but if this collection keeps going, I can't help but feel that this is going to be an iconic series of bottlings. And I can't believe no one else has really used the Underground or the transport network in London for a limited edition series of bottles. Now, I've given these bottles quite a lot of praise, and the Bimber distillery quite a lot of praise so far, but I think it would be naive not to sort of talk about the elephant in the room, and that is the regulations surrounding English whiskey. Now, do you want to guess how many regulations there are for English whiskey? There's 1, and that single rule comes from the Immature Spirits Act of 1915 and 1916 that says that the spirit has got to be matured for a minimum of 3 years. And that's the rules that we abide to, and that's what the Scotch Whisky Association abides to. But that is the only rule with English whisky. Now, there's no problem with that, other than it can be abused. And there's been a lot of talk in the press recently about Japanese whisky and how that doesn't really adhere to many regulations, and you could be importing Scotch, labelling it as Japanese whisky and exporting it again. But that's exactly what is happening and could happen with English whiskey because of this lack of regulation. And Bimber themselves, everything that they don't import spirits and bottle it. Everything that they produce in the distillery gets bottled. But it's quite easy for another distillery to just import a load of scotch, stick their distillery name on it and call it English whiskey. And that is the biggest problem for me. The English whiskey category, if it's going to develop, needs strict guidelines, because you're only as strong as the weakest link. If a distillery comes about and starts causing headlines for all the wrong reasons because of this lack of regulation, the other distilleries are likely to be pulled down in it, owing to the sort of like the lack in consumer confidence. So there we have it. It's the Bimber Spirit of the Underground series. They're going to be released anytime this month, priced at £125 a bottle. And I think they're a really savvy piece of marketing. The fact that they can tie on to these London Underground stations, which opens up the pool for a much wider audience of collectors, means I think this is going to be a really iconic series of bottles. Now, if you want to learn more about Scottish whisky and whisky investment and English whisky, make sure you subscribe to the channel. And if you're looking to buy any bottles of whisky, head over to the Mark Littler shop. And we've also got lots of in-depth guides about how to buy and sell whisky on our website.